Hi guys. So this is an image of 3 different marker lines that I had used in my sketchbook and 3 different pencil marks. And this is the original image that we'll be sourcing for this entire tutorial. So if you are working at home, you can create your brushes out of any kind of writing device you want. A pencil, a pen, a marker of any variety. It can be a Crayola marker, or it can be something that's a little bit more artistic, like a Prismacolor marker. So, feel free to do anything with those marks as you want. This was a page out of my sketchbook. I just took the picture in relatively good lighting with an iPhone and airdropped it to myself. So you can do the same as well, or with any kind of device. Just email yourself the photo or whatever. It is important that you have a piece of paper in the background that is a plain flat color, preferably closer to white, and that you take your photo in good lighting conditions so that you have a pretty good quality photo to begin from. So we're going to be making 2 types of brushes here with this master file. And I'm going to go through what you have to do in Adobe Photoshop before you make your brushes in Illustrator. So our 2 brushes are going to be our scatter brush, which is sampled from the 3, and our art brush, which is sampled from the bottom. So the first thing that I want you to do is isolate the brush that you want to make into the tool inside of Adobe Illustrator. I'm going to select this middle brush, and you'll notice that it's not quite straight when I draw my rectangle around it. So we have to isolate it and straighten it before we turn it into a brush, and I'll show you why after the brush is made. So with my rectangular marquee tool here in this menu, I've selected it, and I'm simply going to cut by hitting Command X, create a new document to isolate it by hitting Command N, and using the clipboard that I have cut that image into, I'm going to create my new document. So you'll see that it will already pick up the dimensions here in pixels or in inches, and it'll pick up the resolution. I'm just going to use 600 dpi here because I want to make sure that I'm working with this high resolution document. And I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to use a grayscale image instead of a full color image. All right, so I'm going to create my new document. Oh, before I forget, I want to name it. I'm going to name it Art Brush Original Image. So create that file. And then I'm going to hit Command V and place my brush in here. So you'll notice that my brush is now in grayscale. It takes the entire clipping area that I had just cut from the other document. So now it's time to go through and make sure that this brush is straight. So now that I have my brush here and I want to make sure that it's straight, I'm going to be using the Liquify tool. So clicking inside of Photoshop's filter menu, you'll see that in the middle section here, it's the second from the bottom in this middle section here. And you can see the shortcut here is Shift Command X for the Liquify. So this tool will basically allow you to kind of push sections of the brush to the left or right or up and down. And the goal here is to get the brush as straight as possible. So depending on the brush size you use, you can see that only a certain amount of pixels will move. So with a smaller brush, only smaller sections will move when you start clicking and pulling left or right. But if I make the brush larger, and I can do that either with the sliders here, or I can do that with just really quickly with my open and close brackets, I can move larger sections of the brush left or right. So this helps when you're trying to straighten out the entire line. But for small sections here, you want to make the brush smaller so that you can tweak these little areas. And the goal is to get it as straight as possible. So you may want to keep referring back to your edge as the guide here. Now that you've gotten your brush straight, it's time to adjust some of the settings so that you get a nice clean sample of this brush. So the idea here excuse me, is to eliminate the presence of paper behind the image, because you can see here that when we liquefied, some of the background aspects are now kind of showing through. So we need to get a really nice clean image to make sure that when we convert this to a bitmapped object, if we were to save this out as a JPEG and live trace it immediately in Illustrator, it would take a good sample. So I like to do this with the destructive editing of the levels. And I say destructive because I'm using the image menu and not an adjustment layer. So I like to make the line as dark as I can, but I still want to pick up some of the quality of that graininess of the line, and to make the paper as light as I can. So I don't want any of that detail of the paper coming through. And you can adjust your mid-range value to make your stroke either more textured or more filled. So I'm going to hit OK. I think I've gotten to a good place here. The last step that you're going to do, or the last few steps that you're going to do, is you're going to convert this image mode from grayscale to bitmap. So that is simply just selecting this option here. And it's going to ask you a series of questions. Do you want to flatten layers? Yes, I do. What resolution do you want it at? You can do 600 for a higher fidelity line or 300 for lower. And you're going to be using the method of 50% threshold, which basically means that when an image is turned into a bitmap, it is turned into either a 0 for white pixel or 1 for black pixel. So depending on how many bits are in this image, you either have a 0 or a 1 for white or black. So this is the most basic type of image that you can have. So I'm going to 600 pixels per inch, 50% threshold. I'm going to hit OK. And then the last step that I'm going to do to this art brush before I work on it in Illustrator is File, Save As a TIFF. I'm just going to save this to my desktop for quick reference. All right, so our art brush is down. You'll remember that we're making 2 brushes in this tutorial. So the next brush I'm going to have to sample for is my scatter brush. So I'm back to my rectangular marquee tool, and I'm drawing a box around the brush that I want to use for my scatter brush. So right here, I'm just going to select this area, and I'm going to cut and create a new document by hitting Command N from my clipboard in 600 dpi in grayscale. And yeah, it's already taken up my pixels and everything. And I'm going to name it Scatter Brush Original. So hit create. For this, the steps are much, much simpler because it's not like I have to straighten out the scatter brush here. So what I really want to do is, now that it's in grayscale, I want to do my destructive adjustment, my level adjustment, because I want to make sure that the mark is dark and clear, has a high fidelity, and the paper is eliminated. So here I'm going to be using those like lower and upper, probably much more than I'm going to be using my mid-range, because remember I'm going to have to drop this into Illustrator for a live trace, so I don't want any of the details of the paper coming through. So once I've gotten there, I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm going to convert this into a bitmap image, much like I did last time. Do I want to flatten layers? Yes. 600 dpi at 50% threshold, OK. And I'm going to save this as my Scatter Brush Original TIFF file. So, and I'm going to save it to my desktop. And that's it. Your scatter brush is pretty much taken care of at this point. So I've moved to Illustrator now. I have a 5" by 5" artboard at a high resolution in CMYK color space. I've also got my whole screen zoomed into my window, so I've hit Command 0 to center that. And I've got my brushes panel open here next to my toolbar. However you like to have them open in your program is up to you. But if you don't have that available, it's under Window and Brushes right here. So in Illustrator, the first step is to file place both of your brush TIFFs in the artboard. You just go to File, Place, and select them wherever they are on your desktop and put them there. The second option is to live trace these brushes. So I'm going to select both of, I'm going to live trace them one at a time so that I have complete control over it. So with the brush selected, I can see here in my control bar that I can image trace. That's what I want to select. But I also have the option to image trace from the menu, the object menu here, where it says Make. Now you have a context menu here in your image trace panel that allows you to control the threshold of your brush, which affects the quality of your trace. If you hit preview, you can see just a live update of adjusting the threshold, what that does. So I'm going to go ahead and increase it here. And the fidelity of your pass, which is low for smoother or high for more detail. That's what I want. Less or more corners, less or more noise, more noise. And then what I want to do here is make sure that I select ignore white, which will get rid of that ugly white box that happens outside of your traced image. So once I've done that, you can see that it has already updated the trace for me. I'm just going to close out of this window and I'm going to hit expand. And what this does is it turns this one path into an editable vector path. So if I were to take my direct selection tool, you can see that all of these little points here are on this line. So really quickly, I'm going to zoom out again and I'm going to do that image trace to my scatter brush. So image trace, contextual menu, make my adjustments here and hit ignore white, close the window out and expand. And I have my vector pass of my scatter brush. So to turn this long skinny brush into an art brush, I need to go to my brushes panel, which I have here, and hit the flyout menu. I'm going to select new brush. And from this, I'm going to select art brush and hit OK. This will bring up your art brush options. The very first thing that you want to do is name it. So I'm going to name this with the tool I drew it with. Pentel Sign Pen Brush 01. And you can make all kinds of adjustments you want to. Here's your opportunity to really experiment with the width of the mark itself, with some of the other kind of proportions, whether you want the brush to fit stroke length or repeat or scale proportionally. It's up to you. The direction you want your brush to go in. So this is obviously the top of my brush and this is the bottom. If I do a brush that goes like this, you'll see for the mark I make, this is how it's going to lay the brush out. That is incorrect. You can do colorization. Just really have fun with it here and see what your options are. And hit OK. So I can use this brush now as a bona fide art brush if I select it here. Whoops, I'm applying my brush to my brush, so I'm going to deselect my brush. I'm going to hit my brush tool, and you can see that I now have the ability to use this brush as a working art brush. So how would you use that? Obviously, you could use it to draw a particular shape or a line if you want. Or you can use it as a stroke around an object here. So when I fill it, it becomes this kind of like really cool hand-drawn look to it here. And this is where getting your brush straight is super important because you see that there's a little bloop here where the brush does not quite extend beyond the shape. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, where the circle itself is kind of going outside of the brush mark and create a really clean vector line. So maybe I'll go back and edit that to make sure that it's straight. Okay, so that's your art brush. To make your scatter brush, it's a lot of the same, except you have more options here to play with when you turn it into a brush. So from your flyout menu, select new brush with your scatter brush selected. Select scatter brush from the radio buttons and name it. Dotted scatter brush is pretty good for me. Again, a lot of options to experiment with here. So you can have the size at random. You can say it's anywhere from 122 of its original scale to, 87% of its original scale. You can say that the spacing is varied or fixed depending on how you want to use it. The scatter is the degree in which it is above or below the line. So you can say I want it, negative, or I don't care. I want it 36 above the line, or negative 53 below the line. And the rotation, which is a random degree of negative 180 or positive 180 relative to the path that you draw. Just play with your options here and see what it does. as well as the colorization. I'm not going to mess with it here because I'm trying to keep this tutorial short. So your scatter brush is really interesting because depending on what type of path you make or how you use it, you can see that it does different things. So here is the scatter above and below. You can see that it's rotating 180. Variety here is the key in making sure your scatter brush works. And density. So if I take my brush here and I scribble a whole lot at the bottom, and then I have these really wide swooping lines at the top, you can see that it creates this dense to expansive pattern here. You can even apply scatter brushes to the outside of shapes. So if I wanted to, do a circle and apply my scatter brush, you can see how the scatter brush is applied there as well. So there's just two really quick options to customize the brushes that you're using in your Adobe software. One final note about these brushes is that they don't automatically save to your brushes panel and are accessible every time you make a new document. So to demonstrate this, I've made a new document, and you'll notice that my brushes panel only has the default brushes in it. If I wanted to carry them over to a new document, I need to save out an Illustrator file where I had made the brushes so that I can copy and paste them into the new file easily and quickly. And you'll notice that once I copy and paste an object that has had that brush applied to it, it now pops up in my panel. So again, if you don't save this original Illustrator file with your brushes in them, you lose them. So make sure that you save your original Illustrator file with the brushes in them that are named so that you can copy and paste from them easily. I'm sure there are other ways of adding brushes to libraries or maybe even exporting brushes and organizing them, but this is just the quick kind of easy hack to remember how to keep your brushes around for the long term.